Professor Sidney Hook of New York University is one of America's foremost political philosophers. Here he discusses the meaning of freedom. Professor Hook.
In the life of all nations, there comes a time for stock-taking and appraisal of the national heritage. Sometimes it comes after a great disaster, like a lost war. Sometimes it comes on the eve of a grave decision, when a people confronts fateful alternatives of policy. In our own country, it comes at a time when we have been brushed by the dark wings of history. The tragic death of President Kennedy provides an occasion for reassessment and national self-understanding. It is a challenge to each reflective person to rethink his commitments as a citizen of his nation and as a member of a society which establishes obligations as well as bestowing privileges. What does the American idea represent today? Is America merely stale promises decked out in holiday rhetoric? Are American ideals still viable? Do they represent the living reality? Or is the gap between American ideals and American reality so wide that the ideals themselves are compromised? Is the American heritage distinctively American, or does it contain universal elements which can be made the basis of an acceptable world order? These are some of the questions all intelligent Americans must sooner or later grapple with. In human experience, the ultimate test of men's loyalties are not words, but actions. There are many things we act on, love and friendship and neighborliness, that we find difficult to articulate, to put into the words which catch and adequately convey the quality of our emotions. But it is not really necessary to find the proper words for our deepest emotions, for the things we do express and redeem our pledges to each other much more than mere words. After all, not everything can be said or need be said. Why then does this not suffice with respect to our political faith and allegiance? Why do we have to become aware of our commitments, to declare them, to reflect on them, to discuss and to debate them? Is it not enough to know, for example, that if all the curtains of the world were rung up, the iron, the bamboo, and the barbed wire curtains which divide the world, the movements of peoples would be towards the free world and to America, its citadel? So much was frankly admitted by those who built the Berlin Wall, for it was not erected to keep citizens of the West out, but to pen those who lived behind that wall in. Is it necessary, therefore, in the light of these and similar facts, to have to spell out the reasons, to make explicit the grounds of our allegiance to our society? The answer is yes, for in political affairs we cannot take for granted the general acceptance we find with respect to basic human values like love and friendship or kindness. There are individuals, parties, entire states which believe, despite the movement of individuals towards the West, that the way of life of the totalitarian society is better than or superior to our own, and that not all or even most human beings know what is for their own good, and therefore need rulers who know better than they do what is good for them. Our democratic world and its legacy of ideas are under constant attack and criticism. It is being challenged to justify itself, and to such a challenge we cannot merely reply, "Everyone knows it is good." Our world faces not only the challenge of those who are opposed to it and who would destroy it, it confronts the challenge which its own endemic problems create. We must apply the ideals by which we profess to live to a host of new problems, economic, social, political, ethnic, and racial. Unless we become aware of what those ideals are, why, and in which way we are committed to them, we are blind, groping in the darkness of the future instead of illuminating it. Now, the first word which comes to our lips when we seek to describe our political ideal is democracy. Often it rises no higher than our lips. If it reaches our mind, the term democracy raises as many problems as it answers. For after all, those who are determined to destroy the American way of life call themselves Democrats too, and the system with which they would replace it, a democracy. How do we distinguish between our democracy and theirs? Between the democracy to which we give our reflective loyalty and the new democracy, organic democracy, guided democracy, higher democracy, socialist democracy, with which the totalitarianisms of the 20th century have contrasted it. The key to the crucial difference is found in another expression, freedom. This term is only slightly less ambiguous than democracy, but when the two are coupled together, we have a concept which we can fruitfully explore. No matter what kind of system is called democratic, we are committed to one in which human beings retain their basic freedom. What kind of freedom is this? In what sense is it basic? My answer is that the basic sense of freedom in our society is freedom of choice, freedom to choose who shall govern us, and the freedom to dismiss or replace our governors if they do not suit us. This is what we mean by self-government. Self-government does not mean that all of us collectively govern ourselves in all things. This is impossible. It means that all of us who are qualified as citizens, through our freely elected representatives, are both rulers and ruled. And this is what the Declaration of Independence implies when it limits the just powers of any government to the freely given consent or choice of the governed. If we take a fresh look at the meaning of these words, we shall discover that they possess remarkable, even revolutionary implications. They challenge the validity of every elite theory of human rule, whether it is an elite of kings or aristocrats, philosophers or priests, politicians or professional reformers, a theory which is continuously being revived whenever it is advocated that we surrender popular sovereignty to experts. More important, the ideal of a self-governing political community comes nearest to expressing the principle of permanent revolution in human affairs, for it assumes that all normal or mature human beings who are affected by the decisions of government and the institutions of a society should have a voice and a vote, and therefore some power in determining them, in conserving them or transforming them. If this is what freedom means, we can more readily see what it does not mean. Freedom is not to be equated with any particular economic system, but with the right to choose the economic system under which one wishes to live. The greatest error is to assume that what basically divides the communist and Western worlds is their different economic systems, what is officially called socialism on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and what is traditionally called capitalism or free enterprise on this side. What really divides them is freedom, the freedom to choose the kind of economy the people want, a freedom denied to the subjects of all communist countries by communist theory and still more by communist practice. Even under their minority one-party dictatorships with their absolutely controlled press and radio and educational system, the communist rulers dare not risk giving their workers the right to choose. It is this right to choose freely which our Constitution and Declaration of Independence enshrines. And what we mean by freedom is not free enterprise or any other economic system, but the proud and precious freedom to choose to move towards capitalism, socialism, or a mixed economy, or away from them. When we speak of democracy, therefore, we must recognize that central to it is this notion of freely given consent, or a freedom of choice, which is both a political and a moral concept or ideal. And it is important to recognize this, because if we do not, we shall stumble into many pits of misunderstanding. Let me explicate first its political side. When we speak of a self-governing community, we presuppose freely given consent. But how do we establish the existence of freely given consent? Mere voting by itself is not enough. All the dictators conduct elections or plebiscites in which they report that 99% or thereabouts of the population endorses their policy. But no one is taken in by these farcical procedures, because it is obvious that despite the elections, no genuine choice has been offered. Without the existence of a legally recognized opposition party, consent or choice is not free, nor is even the existence of an opposition party sufficient. Such a party may be tolerated, but unless it enjoys legally guaranteed freedom of propaganda, which entails freedom of speech, press, and assembly, those who choose remain ignorant of possible alternatives. And an ignorant choice, one deprived of the possibility of learning about relevant alternatives, is not a free choice. Nor is this all. To be free to exercise one's choice means to be free not only from physical coercion, but from economic coercion, the threat of economic sanctions, for example, the loss of employment, if one's political choice offends against the reigning orthodoxy. All these freedoms, in turn, depend for their validity on something which, for want of a better phrase, we may call the rule of law. On paper, a government may recognize a great many freedoms, but if it has the power to arrest its citizens arbitrarily, imprison, deport, or execute them by administrative decree or juridical frame-ups or demonstration trials, these freedoms are nugatory. Under such conditions, only those who have a vocation for heroism or martyrdom will exercise them, and then not for long. In order for citizens to practice and enjoy their freedoms, they must not be punished for doing what has not been previously forbidden by an authorized agency. They must not be deprived of the protection of courts, which function independently of the government. The courts, in a genuinely free society, not only pass judgment on individuals who violate the law in their relation to other individuals, but on some matters must be able to say no to those in power and prevent the government itself from tyrannizing over all of its citizens or over a weak minority. This freedom of ours, government by freely given consent, carries with it a cluster of other freedoms integral to its very nature: freedom of speech, press, and assembly, freedom of association, freedom under the rule of law. Once we grasp this, we can make short shrift of the sophisms which suggest that this is only half the story, and by far not the most essential half. This half is referred to as formal political democracy. The other half is called economic democracy, and it is implied that the two are quite distinct. Sometimes apologists of totalitarian regimes are willing to grant that political freedom or democracy exists in the West, but they insist that something they call economic democracy exists in communist countries, and piously add that someday economic democracy will be married to political democracy in order to achieve a perfect social union. And this ceremony is scheduled to take place whenever the leaders of the Communist Party benevolently decide to liquidate their dictatorship, and in this manner disprove Karl Marx's famous generalization that no ruling class ever voluntarily relinquishes its power. But what does it mean to speak of economic democracy? Sometimes this is a misleading phrase for economic equality, which is something quite different from economic democracy. For economic equality is present both when all men are equally starving as well as when all men are equally fed. It may be present when all men are equally enslaved as when they are equally free. If economic democracy has any intelligible meaning, it implies that those who do the world's work have some power to determine the rewards of work, their wages, the hours of work, and the conditions of work. If the workers cannot participate in free bargaining with their employers, private or public, then they run the risk of being ruthlessly exploited, of receiving a smaller slice of the pie that they have baked than they deserve. Economic democracy, in other words, means the existence of free trade unions, or it means nothing. If this is so, then it is utterly false to contrast political democracy with economic democracy. For economic democracy and the practice of free trade unionism requires as necessary conditions freedom of speech, press, assembly under the rule of law, which define the essence of political democracy. Political democracy without economic democracy is incomplete, but economic democracy without political democracy is impossible, a contradiction in terms. So far, I have been talking mainly about the American ideal or ideal of freedom. But freedom is as freedom does. Principles do not operate by themselves. Men must carry them out, and the organized ways in which they carry them out constitute the institutions of a nation. Institutions are organized habits of procedure by which we regulate the social activities of men. And just as we ultimately judge the sincerity of a man's words by his deeds, so we judge the ideal professions of a country by its institutional practices. And when we turn our gaze from the burnished abstractions about democracy and freedom to the actual institutional behavior in these, our United States, what do we find? We find, alas, a very imperfect state of affairs, multiple violations of our professed ideals, disregard of the basic human rights, not to speak of the political rights of our Negro fellow citizens in some communities, large pockets of poverty and unemployment, inadequate housing, schooling, and medical care, and as accompaniment to all this, we hear excited talk and extravagant nonsense on all sorts of subjects by extremists and extravagant exaggeration of the dangers of extremism. The truth, however, will not and cannot be denied. There is a gap between American professions and performance, which every honest mind must recognize. How great is it, and what does it signify? Does it signify that it is hypocrisy to speak of American freedom in the face of American failure to live up to its own ideals? This was the charge that Goebbels, the propagandist-in-chief of Hitler's Germany, leveled against the United States during the last war. Mocking our official claim that we were fighting for the defense of free institutions, Goebbels called attention to the disabilities and outrages under which Negroes and other minorities lived in some regions of the country. He circulated graphic pictures of mob violence against Negroes and claimed they surpassed anything which at the time the Nazis had done against the Jews. He described the role played by men of wealth, plutocrats he called them, in American society, and made invidious comparisons between the vast systems of social insurance which existed in Nazi Germany and the United States. Goebbels was not wrong about many of the facts he cited, although he exaggerated greatly. But he was profoundly wrong in his interpretation of the facts and in the charges of hypocrisy which he made. Why was he wrong? For many reasons, but I have time to mention only two. First, many of the sorry practices he called attention to were actually violations of American law, whereas the infamous Nazi practices were official practices of the totalitarian regime he represented. The chief spokesman of American public opinion as well as the overall consensus of the country, the executive power, the courts, the leaders of church, school, and bar, all outspokenly condemn these outrages. Secondly, with respect to practices and conditions which were not technical violations of the law, but still offended against basic human decencies, Goebbels was blind to the direction in which things were moving. At the time he described them, conditions indeed left a great deal to be desired, but he did not ask whether these deplorable conditions were better or worse than they had been, whether they were signs of greater and faster improvement. And these were the all-important questions, because many of the evils in American life were a legacy of the past, which we inherited, a legacy that could not be liquidated at once, a legacy for which we who are alive today are responsible for only with respect to what we do or fail to do with it in the present and future. The sins of the fathers may be visited on the heads of their children unto the third and fourth generation, but the children are not morally responsible for their fathers' sins. The responsibility of the children is defined by what they do, by the kind of world they bequeath to their offspring. Today, the external or foreign criticisms of the culture of free societies is made not by the propagandists of fascism, but by the much more skillful propagandists of communism. They, too, repeat much of the indictment that Goebbels made of American hypocrisy. But their criticism is more fundamental. Even if there were no shameful denials of political freedom to Negroes in some regions of the country, even if we had a perfect score with respect to civil and political rights, the communists would still declare our freedom and democracy a sham. For they contend that so long as the economy is not owned or controlled by the government, so long as there are owners of capital who live on their capital and those who live by working, democracy will always be a democracy of the minority. According to Lenin, the founder of the Soviet Union, in Western democracies, the workers who constitute the majority of the population are permanently debarred from participating in social and political life. This criticism is radically misconceived. From the point of view of freedom or democracy, the important thing about an economy is not who owns what, but whether the political and human rights of individuals are furthered by the economic system or restricted by it, and whether the standard of material life is increasing for the whole society at the same time as the inequalities in living conditions are decreasing. Absolute equality is impossible, of course, even if it were desirable. The communist criticism of free societies on this score falls far short of the mark with respect to the growth of political and human rights and the redistribution of wealth in the economy, without denying in the least that in American society different classes have different political power, that money still talks in places where it should not be heard, that a great deal still remains to be done to draw all elements of the population into the political process, it is still true that more Americans possess more political rights than ever before in American history, that American workers and farmers, through their organizations, play a very active political role, and that the chief obstacles to greater participation in the political process by the people of this country is their own disinterest and unconcern, a state of affairs which is not irremediable. Secondly, the exercise of political democracy in the Western world and in this country has led to profound modifications in the economy. In every field, from medical and social services to education, a great deal must be done. But what has already been done through the operation of our tax laws, free trade unionism, and social legislation has produced greater equality or more greatly reduced inequalities than at any period in our own past. In comparison with communist countries, our own mixed economy has outproduced them in most agricultural and industrial commodities. At the same time, one can observe greater inequality in earned income between the highest and lowest echelons of communist industry than is the case in most Western countries. Let us grant for the moment that the violations of political and human rights in our country are as grave as our enemies declare them to be. Let us grant that economic inequalities and injustices still abound. We could nonetheless acquit ourselves of any honest indictment. For so long as the processes of freely given consent remain intact, so long as our political heritage of freedom is a living reality, we can, by political action, legislation, and education, progressively diminish these violations, these inequalities, and injustices. Here again, the direction of movement is all important. Is it forward towards our professed ideals or backwards, away from them? That is the crucial question. The criticisms which the enemies of freedom make of our society can easily be met. But this is not sufficient for our purposes. We have a responsibility to realize our own professed ideals, to eliminate our own weaknesses, no matter what others say about us. To be sure, we can point out that no matter what our failures, the alternatives to a free society are worse, much worse. As Winston Churchill once put it, democracy, he said, is the worst possible form of government except all the others which have been tried. Nonetheless, we cannot rest satisfied so long as there are grave problems which sit on our doorstep. We must grapple with them independently of what the situation is elsewhere. The life of any society consists of a succession of problems whose solution raises other problems without end. Man is born to troubles as the sparks fly upward. Only in heaven, if anywhere, is there surcease from problems. A free society, however, differs from other societies in that the succession of problems moves towards certain ideals, which, although not completely realizable, may be approached closer and closer. What are these ideals of a free and self-governing society? Perhaps the simplest way of stating them is to say, drawing upon the great documents by Jefferson and Lincoln, that a free society aims to provide equal opportunity for all individuals to realize themselves as human beings or as persons. To be a fully developed person is to be someone who has achieved as far as possible the reach of his potential growth. A free society is one, therefore, in which there is an equality of concern for all citizens to achieve their maximum growth as persons, one whose institutions are so organized as to reflect that concern. This equality of concern for all human beings, independent of race, color, sex, religious ancestry, or national origins, to develop themselves to their fullest, is the ethical ideal central to a free democratic society. Now, equality of concern does not mean mechanical equality of treatment in every respect. It does not mean a policy which aims at a dead and mediocre uniformity, but on the contrary, to recognition and appreciation of differences. William James, the great American psychologist and philosopher, once said, "There is very little difference between any two human beings, but whatever difference between them there is makes all the difference in the world. In this difference is found the magic of personality. Equality of concern, therefore, recognizes the equality of differences, that every individual human being has as much right as every other human being to be treated as an end in himself. Here is the crucial principle which enables us to distinguish between inequality of treatment, which violates the ethics of democracy, and the inequalities of treatment which fulfill the ethics of democracy. If human beings are treated unequally because of some arbitrary, irrational prejudice, usually sustained by myths and errors of fact, the spirit of democracy is violated. If, for example, human beings are denied the exercise of their voting privileges, even when they have fulfilled all legal qualifications, if they are denied opportunities for employment, even when they are qualified, if they are denied free access to and use of public facilities, even when they are as orderly and law-abiding as those who use them, if they are treated as outcasts and social pariahs in whose presence others flee, if disdain and scorn and hate results in de facto or legal segregation, then the principles and ideals of democracy are being dragged in the mire. For in these situations, the inequality of treatment does not flow from any rational consideration. It is not related to the needs of individuals to become fully developed persons. On the contrary, such inequality crushes and destroys the individuals because it blights legitimate opportunities for development. Inequality of treatment can be justified only when it is related to objective differences in need or to differences in merit. The gravely ill human being needs different medical treatment from that required by someone suffering from a slight indisposition. The better endowed or more gifted student, whether in music or mathematics, requires a different educational experience to bring out the best in him from what is required to bring out the best in those of his fellow students who may be less gifted. But the inequalities of treatment, if legitimate, are equally designed to bring out the best in all individuals. Lack of clarity in distinguishing between these two different senses or policies of inequality lies at the bottom of certain rationalizations which seek to preserve those arbitrary patterns of discrimination in our society which are conspicuously not related to need or to merit. It also accounts for the perversion of the democratic ideal of equality into policies enforcing uniformity, as if it meant that equals and unequals must always be treated alike. Both misinterpretations are roads to disaster. As we look over the American scene in which you and I live and move and have our being, our task, if we believe in freedom, is cut out for us. This is to narrow the gap between the ideal and reality in every sphere of culture, and never to lose sight of the truly revolutionary principle of the American political experience. This principle declares that those who wear the shoes are sufficiently mature to know where they pinch, and are therefore justified in changing political shoes in the light of experience. This revolutionary principle is denied by all totalitarians from antiquity to the present. All of them contend that most human beings are either too stupid or too vicious or both to be entrusted with their own destinies. To which Thomas Jefferson made the unanswerable retort. Sometimes it is said that man cannot be trusted with the government of himself. Can he then be trusted with the government of others? Or have we found angels in the form of kings to govern him? Let history answer this question. In this task of closing the gap between ideal and reality, there are two things particularly which we must bear in mind. One is that democracy is not only a way of political and social life, but of personal life too. What does it mean to say that democracy is a way of personal life? It means that as citizens in relation to each other, we must learn to live with our differences and respect each other despite these differences as they emerge in the unending dialogue of political life. We must learn that a political opponent is not an enemy, and we must never lose sight of the human being in our political opponent. We must eschew not merely the violence of the deed. If we do not, we are embarked upon civil war, but the violence of the word, which bruises and slurs and degrades and shuts the doors of human understanding. Words are often triggers to action, and we must be concerned not only with what we say, but how we say it. We must leave claims to absolute truth and infallibility to others, and not merely proclaim our willingness to learn from those with whom we may disagree. We must guarantee them a hearing until their words constitute a clear and present danger to the peace of a self-governing community. The second thing relevant in this connection is that the necessary decisions which we must make to solve the pressing problems of democratic life depend upon knowledge of fact and knowledge of values, upon ability to evaluate evidence, to sort out what is relevant from the irrelevant, to distinguish between empty slogans and meaningful ideals, and to test these ideals by immersing them in the cynical acids of analysis. To do this, we must recognize that the life of citizenship in a free society is one of continuous education and self-education. The world is changing rapidly under the impact of science, technology, and the increasing power of other nations. Jefferson's warning that no nation can long remain free if it remains uneducated and unenlightened has more point today than when they were uttered. Never was it more false to say, what we don't know won't hurt us. What we don't know may destroy us and our heritage of freedom forever. There are many things we do not know which require a technical education to master, but these, fortunately, are not central to the important value decisions which we must make in our present time of troubles. There are other things central to these decisions which all of us can learn more about: the structure of our own government, its economy, the life of our cities, our regional subcultures. We must also learn more about the cultures of other countries, the geography of their minds, the clash of doctrines and ideologies which inspire them, and the contours of the great maps of life drawn up in hope and tears for human salvation.